Shabbat Shalom. So, fun fact, I was one of the first kids in the US to read Harry Potter. I had close relationships with my local librarians and my local bookstore, which meant that they often gave me advanced reader copies of books, either before they were published or before they were released, to ask my opinion and ask if I thought they should stock that book. So in late 1997, early 1998, before Harry Potter was published in the US, I got an advanced reader copy, and they said, hey, do you think we should get this book for our store, for our library? I devoured that first book and enthusiastically encouraged my librarians to get it. That was the beginning of a reading journey that changed my life. I was roughly the same age as the characters in Harry Potter when each of the books was released, which meant that I basically grew up with the novels. And they made an indelible imprint on my soul. The author's bigoted comments over the last few years have complicated my relationship to the series, but I know without question that I am the person I am today because I read those stories of bravery and love and friendship and belief in the power of magic to change the world. Psychiatrist Vamik Volkan writes about group identity as being like the fabric of a tent. Anyone who belongs to that group gets covered by the fabric of the tent. And so he imagines major events in the group's history, collective traumas and major narratives, as like stitching in the fabric of that tent or embroidery, so that even those who didn't personally experience something are still covered, are still inside of that narrative. By associating with the community under that tent, the narrative of a group's history becomes part of an individual's story. In other words, reading or reciting the stories of our people, even ones that we never personally lived, brings us more closely into our communal identity. Once a story becomes part of the tent's fabric, all it takes is one little tug on the thread of that story to bring the whole community closer together and to bring that narrative to everyone's attention. The Parsha this week, Hukkat, contains one of the most impactful stories in the Torah, the moment of Moshe striking the rock to demand water. It also tells of the death of Aaron, the first high priest, setting up the line of succession for the priesthood. But most of the Parsha, and most of what we're going to read today, is a travelogue. It's lists of places that the Israelites walked and encamped somewhere else and encamped there. And amid this description of encampments and borders of various other tribes, we read, Al ken ya'amer b'sefer milchamot Adonai, et vahev b'sufa ve'et hanachalim arnon. Therefore, the book of wars of Adonai speaks of Vaheb and Sufa and the Wadis Arnon. It's a fragment of a sentence, a reference to a previously unheard of book of wars of Adonai, and it's exactly the kind of phrase that piques the interest of a fantasy reader who loves a good heroic battle scene. The commentators are similarly intrigued by what this book of wars of Adonai is and why we don't know more about it. According to Ramban, the simple meaning of in the book of wars of Adonai is that there were wise men who used to write down the history of great wars. These authors were called moshlim, they that speak in mashalim, in parables, because they wrote in their books by means of proverbs and figures of speech, and when there were victories which they considered wonderful, they ascribed those wars to God. Now the victory of Sichon over Moab was marvelous in their eyes, therefore they wrote it down in a book. Rabbi Bachya takes this idea of non-biblical sacred texts even further, noticing that there are other places in Tanakh where the text references a book that we no longer have. He says that it's entirely possible that this book of wars of Adonai, as well as many others, were lost in the course of our long history and wanderings. The book of wars' first entry may have been Abraham's campaign to rescue his nephew Lot in the book of Breshit, and it's possible that references to the prophecies of Natan and Iddo in 2 Chronicles, the Chronicles of Jewish Kings in 2 Kings, the songs and parables of King Solomon in 1 Kings, that these are all further examples of historical records which have been lost over time. These moshlim, these story weavers, did the work of stitching communal stories into the tent fabric, in the Book of Wars and in other lost records. The story of a battle against Moab from this parsha was written down in this now lost Book of Wars. and it becomes just one more part of a highly decorated tent that we now live inside. Though we don't have the text of this book of wars, the Torah preserves its memory, and it therefore helps us hold on to the moral of the story. In what would have been an impossible battle against Moab, and after a series of other battles, God aided the Israelites and gave them the courage to fight back. We're prompted by this one little verse in our Parsha to remember a time when we fought against a stronger foe with the aid of God, with the aid of a strong leader, and with a brave community. The spiritual wisdom in keeping and referencing a book of wars of Adonai, or any of the other works that Rabbeinu Bachya mentioned, is that they preserve the memory of meaningful stories like this one, of defending against the attack of Moab, even when the Israelites were so tired. They become, by mentioning these texts, an indelible part of our tent fabric. These works, even if we don't know what they say, remind us that we are not alone, that courage and faith and telling beautiful stories is part of our communal identity. I am still an avid fantasy reader, and one of the reasons that I love these books is because they give me a touch point to access my own courage. Since reading Harry Potter in elementary school, I have read dozens, at least, other fantasy series, and they have all helped me hone my own personal understanding of bravery. And I think about them whenever I need to do something scary or vulnerable. I may not be the main character responsible for saving all of humanity from an existential threat, but when I need to do something that scares me, I do think about Aragorn leading the armies of Gondor and Rohan against the Black Gate in Lord of the Rings, or a Violet Sorrengail crossing the parapet to become a dragon rider in Fourth Wing. These stories have become part of my story because I have read and reread them, and because I choose to empathize with those characters, to attach myself to their lessons. The Book of Wars of Adonai and so many other stories in Tanakh and across Jewish tradition are our people's touch point for Jewish courage. These battles are part of our story, and therefore they're part of our identity. In moments when we are weary from journeys and don't feel like we have the strength to continue standing up against those who challenge us, reading about the Book of Wars of Adonai tugs on that thread that reminds us that we've survived before. It helps us to summon courage when we might need it. There's a popular song that I learned at camp. You might know it from Shabbat tables and other Jewish spaces. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar meod v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal, the song says. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the important thing is not to be afraid at all. It's based on a line from Likutei Moharan, a collection of teachings by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. But the song that we sing, it's actually a misquote from Rabbi Nachman. The line actually says, in Likutei Moharan, V'da sheha'adam tzarich la'avor al gesher tsar me'od me'od, v'ha'klal v'ha'ikar shelo yitpached klal. Know that each and every person needs to pass along a very, very narrow bridge, but the principle and the most important thing is not to give in to fear at all. Shelo yitpached klal, to not give in to fear. The goal is not to live without feeling fear, but to not succumb to the fear and fall away from our path. Rabbi Nachman's guidance is to strive to be able to live with that fear and still have courage. Courage, ometz, it's part of who we are as a Jewish people, and especially here at BJ. Ometz is one of our 6 community covenant values, reminding us that we as a community, and I quote, aspire to be spiritually and communally courageous. Our covenant reads that ometz is engaging challenging issues and conversations and taking risks to work for a better world, confronting and wrestling with challenges presented by our own sacred texts and liturgy, and learning from all with humility and curiosity. These things are part of our BJ tent fabric. This week, I longed to see courage among our elected leaders in Washington. As lawmakers debated a bill that will make massive, devastating cuts to Medicaid and nutrition assistance, I hoped to see more members of Congress have the courage to stand up for their constituents. Yet it seems that our hyper-polarized political atmosphere has a chokehold on any politician who would publicly oppose their party. Voting on the bill came down almost entirely along party lines, with several lawmakers decrying the bill and then voting to pass it. If representing the needs of a constituency in Congress is like walking a very narrow bridge, this week I fear too many elected officials gave in to fear. Despite having made promises not to touch health or nutrition benefits, our legislators passed a bill that will do just that, along with ballooning the national debt. It is, to me, a failure of courage on two levels. The courage of just a few senators or congresspeople could have changed the fate of the social safety net for millions of Americans. But I also fear how this moment will impact our American tent fabric. We need to be able to tell and retell stories of courage, to point to times when we fought against the odds, but we did not fight alone, in order to stitch an American narrative in which we all stand up for people that we represent, who we live with, who we are in community with. If we cannot tug on the thread of a story of defiance, who will we become? I know I'm not the first nor the second rabbi to stand here and speak about fear in the last few weeks, and to speak about the bravery that it takes to push back even when we are afraid. It is a balm and a blessing to me to be part of a community that values courage, both here at BJ and in the Jewish community at large. And while I am personally crushed that more congresspeople and senators didn't stand up against a piece of legislation that will gut our social safety net, I'm also encouraged to tell and retell the stories of all those who did, of people who literally stood up for hours in order to stand up for those who stand to lose health care, of people who are already organizing to ensure that vulnerable Americans don't lose their ability to buy food for their families, to care for their aging loved ones, to tell stories of people who are already mobilizing to run for office so that they can advocate for their neighbors at every level of government. I find it especially moving that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries closed his magic minute on the floor by quoting Representative John Lewis, who is one of our nation's most courageous leaders. For many civil rights activists, the words and deeds of Representative Lewis are like a book of holy wars, a record of making good trouble to protect a great nation. In our personal lives, in this moment in Jewish history, and as a country, be an amplifier of stories of bravery and love and conviction. Make sure that we do not forget the battles we have fought so that we can learn from them and take heart from them. And strive to be a person who does not give in to fear as you walk your own path. You never know who might continue to tell your story, to use it to inspire others for generations to come. Shabbat Shalom.